Hey Facebook, my name is Dr. John Robinson,
And I'm Dr. Christina Vosh.
and we are known as
Les Sex Docs. Oh, wrong country. The Sex Docs.
we haven't gone there yet.
No,
not
that was.
yet. But we are back.
We're back.
It's official.
Yes.
We just got back a little bit ago, a few days ago, from the UK, from London, and from England, and Bath, and that's really loud.
I'm sorry. I'm brainless. Okay, go.
Are you good?
Yeah.
We just got back from the UK. It was a wonderful trip. It was about 2 weeks.
Yeah.
We had the entire family with us.
The Romero Bosch family.
Yeah. It was.
And the Robinson Bosch, if that's what you meant.
Right.
Yeah.
We had about 14 with us at the peak. I mean, people were kind of meeting us at different parts of the trip. And it was fantastic.
Yeah,
what,
it was
what a
great.
great time.
We had a
right?
wonderful time. Everyone behaved really well,
Sort of.
for the most part.
We had a great time. It was, I think, a trip that was long overdue for all of
Yeah.
us, for sure. Just kind of getting a nice little vacation. I'd say it's been over a couple of years since we've done anything like that. So
Yeah.
it was just fantastic. And one of the big reasons why we went was Christina actually sent me a little link to a conference, and they were accepting abstracts for speakers. And she said, why don't you submit an abstract and see whether or not they want you to speak? And I did, and they said yes.
Yes, which was great.
Yeah, it was great. So it gave us an opportunity to be able to go. So it was for the International Congress on Naturopathic Medicine, the 4th International Congress on Naturopathic Medicine. And they've had it in Barcelona and London and Paris, and so it was in London again this particular year. So we went,
Uh-huh.
and it was great.
It was really fun, yeah. The conference itself was wonderful, so thank you again to the, ICNM.
Yeah, ICNM.
Thank you for hosting us.
Yes.
And also to the fellow speakers that were wonderful, chock full of information. We'll be sprinkling some of the things that we learned into future talks, but I think today we really wanted to focus on what it is that we presented because it's such interesting information, and obviously part of the keystone concepts behind what the Sex Docs and the Hormone Zone is really out there trying to do.
Yeah, what we're really all about. So here's what the topic was. It was the global decline of testosterone and sperm in men. So it's true, we are seeing this global decline. From really 3 different generations. We have data going back about 3 generations if we include this generation now. So we can see that sperm levels are lowering. We can certainly see that testosterone levels are lowering. We're also seeing something called the testicular dysgenesis syndrome, which is just something where there's a more increased risk for testicular cancer, different problems with the penis in terms of sort of birth defects and things like that. So we're seeing more of that than we used to. And there's a lot of reasons behind it. And so part of this trip was for me to go and present this concept and maybe talk a little bit about why are we seeing these reasons, and then what's really kind of the result of all of that.
Right. So it was important for us to first of all recognize as a community here that there is a documented decline in testosterone and sperm levels globally in males, with a few exceptions, that are generationally tracked, and that not only the direct problems from that issue, but then all of the health concerns that are sequelae that come from that, like chronic inflammatory conditions, correct?
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things. And those inflammatory conditions can be as a result also of pesticides and environmental toxins. It's probably one of the biggest reasons, and I wound up presenting on that inevitably.
Right. Mm-hmm. Excuse me.
I think one of the things that, at least for me, that I wound up learning quite a bit. By the way, you can go on our website at hormone-zone.com and check out the article that I wrote that's, I don't know, about 50 pages altogether when you include all of the, I couldn't shut my mouth.
It's light reading.
So yeah, it is a little bit technical, but it does go through all these different reasons why. But it's all cited by research and what we're seeing and what some of the controversy is with all of it. But in the midst of that, by the way, it's on the website. But in the midst of researching all of this over these past several months, I think the thing that was most poignant for me, and probably for both of us as we discussed all of this, was the social and the behavioral things behind testosterone. So there's something called behavioral endocrinology. And I kind of knew about it, and we certainly talk about these things to some degree when we're talking with our patients, but inevitably, I don't think it's enough.
No.
And so it winds up being this new thing, I think, yet another facet that we're able to bring of awareness that we can bring to our patients about what the social implications are of hormone decline, in this case,
decline, right.
testosterone
Right.
decline. Yeah.
And it was during that you introduced the notion of the testosterone male.
Yes.
And so, can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so part of the presentation was to sort of bring this all together. I used the picture of the Vitruvian male, which is the Da Vinci male, you know, and he's got his arms spread out like that. And it was just a little visual to say that putting everything together. And part of that would be that there's so many social things with it, and so many psychic things that go along with it, and behavioral things that go along with it, and inevitably the physical things. So it's putting really the mental, the emotional, the physical, maybe even in the inevitably the spiritual kind of aspects of what it means to be male. And the fact that testosterone is important for this idea of maleness, and very much that maleness is important. And I think that maybe in our day and age that maybe, you know, men, for whether good or bad reasons, or maybe they're there or they're not, but for whatever reason, we're seeing the sort of maybe attack on men to some degree.
You know, without getting too soapboxy, we would never want the notion of maleness to become a four-letter word. The reality is that when you have a healthy male, you have a male who's healthy physically, is absent of chronic inflammatory conditions that plague our country, specifically our country, plague the finances of our health system. You have men that perhaps are more prone to want to seek out war because they have something that they need to prove, versus feeling a little bit more firm within their own manlyhood.
Yes.
And then the beauty of that notion of testosterone male and how that is so strongly connected to the testosterone female, which was part of the lecture that I really enjoyed the most. As I always say, one of the reasons why I enjoy working with women so much is because, in general, it is the best way to help affect the next generation. So by keeping male and female, mother and father, let's say, healthy and strong and testosterone minded, we are able to positively impact the future generations.
Yes. And I think what Christina is saying too, I think, is that, well, here's what we discovered. Men will have higher testosterone levels when the mother in the womb has higher testosterone levels. So where do we get the testosterone male? We get it from the testosterone woman. So it starts there, and it is this sort of beautiful synergy going on in both male and female, and this idea of polarity that we talk quite a bit about, certainly in relationships, and that idea of relationship, that maleness in itself is what helps to attract femininity, and femininity is what helps to attract maleness. So,
and that they're not mutually exclusive. You have feminine and masculine energy in both genders. And obviously, when we're speaking gender, we're not talking about sexual orientation at all. We're literally just talking about gender.
The energies of that.
For the purpose of our audience, though, I do want to make sure that we emphasize that just because we're saying that a healthier testosterone level in the female positively impacts testosterone levels in the male son or the fetus, let's always remember, though, that if you are pregnant, testosterone replacement is contraindicated.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I think that the best that we understand, so the standard of care would be that if a woman realized that she became pregnant, that we would stop care at that point. But between
testosterone care.
Yeah, at least that particular care, as far as the testosterone replacement therapy would be concerned. With that said, that in and of itself is somewhat controversial. Women often have very high testosterone levels and give birth to male and female children that are totally fine and normal. And we don't really have any evidence. The first time I ever heard about that through one of my mentors, about the fact that we needed to stop therapy if a woman got pregnant, we had to stop testosterone therapy. And I said, oh, that's interesting. I'd love to see the research on what's some of the problems that we've seen in the unborn fetus. And he said, oh, well, there isn't any. So we don't really have evidence of it, but it's the best thing that we understand. So that's a good nuance there that we should make sure we emphasize. But what else did we learn? I think, back to what you were saying about the idea of the male and the testosterone male and some of this behavioral thing. There's a couple things that was really interesting for me as I went through the research. Men that have higher testosterone levels, they want to get married. Now, what also inevitably happens, we see that testosterone levels can decline once you do get married. But if you have higher testosterone levels, it makes you want to seek out an actual relationship. Mm-hmm. It's not just simply about what we would, in this sort of antiquated thought that men just simply want to, spread the seed, so to speak. Right, yeah. It's not just about that. There actually is this idea. The light just went out. There we go. So that's one thing that was contrary to some of the antiquated thoughts about testosterone.
Well, because I think one of the things that we're commenting on in this whole notion of behavioral endocrinology is intimacy, which is what we as a sex docs really try to hammer home, the notion of intimacy, and this is what feeds then that testosterone male. When you have that partner, then you have higher intimacy, and that goes beyond just sexual need.
Absolutely, that's a really good point. So, was there anything else that you wanted to mention that you liked about the presentation, or me giving the presentation?
The presentation, it's the first time that I wasn't familiar with his presentation before seeing it, so I would like to just take a moment to say that I'm always genuinely in awe just of your charisma and how effective you are at persuading the audience to think for themselves, but somehow they end up agreeing with you, which I think is quite powerful. But I think the reason that it's so impressive, again, having sat through his presentation as a first-time listener, is that you can't dispute the information. And that's what makes what we're doing so darn important. This isn't about us trying to say, drink some Kool-Aid, this is a trend, this is a fad, how cool this is. This is about us saying, here's information, empower yourselves. Yeah. Empower yourselves, make decisions for yourselves, and we believe that you will find your way to these concepts of hormonal health and value them not just for yourself, but then for your contribution to the world.
I think one of the ways that we both tend to present information, whether it's in a presentation or to our patients, we tend to stay away from the word always. We tend to stay away from the word never.
Yeah, definitely.
So in the way I was presenting the information was just like Christina's saying, putting it out there and saying, what do you want to do with it? Mm-hmm. What are you prepared to do? And there's social implications of what we're seeing here with testosterone decline. As another example, and this would be a slight little political thing without being political, but again, presenting it in a way that is neither here nor there, meaning not taking a side. It's just what we see. Men that have higher testosterone levels tend to be more self-reliant. They tend to have political views that are a little bit more self-reliant and perhaps a little bit more capitalistic. Men that have lower testosterone levels tend to have a little bit more groupthink and socialistic in their viewpoints politically. Now, what's interesting about this particular study that just came out recently, actually, that it's also, it's irrelevant of where a man's socioeconomic status sits. So in other words, a poor man who may have need for a little bit more help, but if he's poor but he has higher testosterone levels, he still believes in self-reliance in the capitalistic system. If a man who's rich, who benefited inevitably from a capitalistic system, but has lower testosterone levels, he tends to be a little bit more socialistic in his viewpoints. So,
and there is also a correlation with altruism and philanthropy. I think that those males, again, regardless of their socioeconomic status, tend to be more giving of self.
Absolutely.
Which I think is
great
really
point.
Important.
Very much so. And one more study, and we'll move on from this, but one more study about that they did a great study where men were given the opportunity to roll a die, and then based on which number they actually got money. Mm-hmm. And it was a European study, so they got a certain amount of euros for number 1 or number 2, or if they got a 6, I think they got 0. But it was self-reporting. They just rolled the die, and they would write down what they got. And at the end, they'd hand a piece of paper and say, this is what my score was, give me my money. Uh-huh. And then they checked testosterone levels. The men who had higher testosterone levels, first of all, they all lied.
Right, they all lied.
Meaning they embellished a little bit. But the men who had higher testosterone levels, they lied less. And part of the reason might be that through this altruism, or through this idea of self-reliance and self-confidence, this is what we yield from testosterone. Mm-hmm. It's part of that stimulus of that. So again, this has social implications, and you can take that however you want. So that's some of the really key things I think we brought out of it. I encourage you to check out the the article.
Yeah, and then just remember, there's the absence of the word always and never in those statements. These are just trends. These are tendencies. But it makes me think that perhaps for another day, what we should talk about is the notion of roid rage, to see what truth, if any, is there in that concept, and how does that then correlate to what we're presenting or what we presented there in London.
Okay,
anyways.
now you said that. Now I have to say one more thing.
All right.
So then fine. So
Then
the
let's
final
move on.
final thing. Because you brought up a good thing
Yes.
about violence. So we tend to think of testosterone, men, and violence. And
Yeah.
again, very much a concept in the past maybe 5 to 10 years. It's been very, very disagreed upon now, that there's this antiquated idea that simply testosterone equals violence in men, and it's just not the case. There's a multitude of factors that go along with why there's violence, and it's not just about testosterone. If anything, there's argument to show that lower testosterone and higher cortisol levels is what's leading into more violence, not necessarily just the testosterone in and of itself.
Yes. And then my last comment as well is that, however, it does definitely result in the need for men, and again, let's say boys, although I would say this is true for all kids, to be physically active, to be out there competing, to be out there building themselves up and knowing how to spar verbally as well as physically. These are important traits for the development of the male personality, and that does not mean bully or let's just say bully. Yes, so I would say that they seem to be intermingled lines, but actually they're quite clear. It's more a philosophy with which that person, I think, is exposed and raised.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
that was a great segue there.
Done.
Well said. Okay, so what did you love about England?
So I hadn't been to England, and we say England, but I had only been to London prior. So last time I was there was in 2001, just after 9/11, and it was very hospitable and quite lovely. What I would say I loved about England this time versus talking about London is that we went to Bath, to the ancient city of Bath, and saw the Roman baths, and what a beautiful, beautiful place. It reminds me a little bit of like La Jolla in California, something
Yeah,
like
I
that.
thought about that.
It was so charming and so pretty, and I really appreciated pushing my stroller up and down those hills.
We got exercise.
A lot of exercise, especially when I had my eldest on my back and I was pushing the stroller. I have a lot of gratitude for those built-in workouts when you
Yes.
travel.
We walked several miles, as was evident by the app that my father-in-law, Joe, had, and he would tell us exactly how many steps and how many
Yes.
miles we were walking each
Yeah.
day.
So what I would say I loved the most about England is going to be the establishments, especially food establishments, that had been around since the 1800s or the 1700s, many of them still
Older,
family
yeah.
owned. I just found that to be so incredibly charming and really enjoyed eating, which is usually my answer.
So we definitely did a lot
What
of that.
about you? England?
I really like London. I like being back there. So for me, I'd gone a couple times as a kid at the age of 6 and the age of about 13. And my father was English. So for me, it was like a coming home type of thing for me. Really an intimate kind of experience for me in a lot of ways. So just simply being there was was really great. And seeing the people and seeing some of the nuances and the differences, it was wonderful. The whole
Yeah.
thing was great, and we ate well. And, the pubs were wonderful. We had a lot of fun.
We had a lot of fun. We
But
really
we didn't spend a lot of time there because we wound up then going to Scotland.
To Scotland.
So we spent the majority of our time in Scotland, and we had never been there before.
Amazing.
So what did you like about Scotland?
Scotland was poetry. It was so romantic, not in a fluffy or coiffed way, but just in the raw nature of the country and the buildings and the people and the food and I think what I loved the most was watching the girls be in those green pastures running
around,
like crazy little monsters. They really looked like they belonged to that land in a different time.
Yeah.
You know, my sister would jokingly call them Vikingas or little Vikings because that's really how they look. They're rough and tumble, rolling around the hills, and it was awesome.
Yeah. So one of the reasons too we went, one of the things that I think we took advantage of, or at least I took advantage of while I was there in Scotland, they have these really interesting ancient Scottish lifting stones, manhood stones. And there's
Feats of strength.
Feats of strength, and they're just a stone, and they're scattered throughout the Highlands. And there's maps to them, and you can kind of figure out where they are. And so I rented a car, which was an
adventure in and of itself.
Absolutely. I felt like my 15-year-old who went with me, and she's almost 16 now and getting her license, and as she's driving, she often talks things out. She says, "I'm now turning left," and she says it out loud because that's what you need to do as a new driver. Well, I wound up doing the same thing because turning left and right there is a whole different thing than what we're doing. Everything's opposite. So I had to really kind of talk it out loud. And actually, when we first got the car, we had just got out of St. Andrews. There's that light one again. We just got out of St. Andrews, and that's where I rented the car. And within about, 10 minutes, I blew both tires because I hit a curb. I was going around a roundabout and just kind of I didn't feel so bad because after I spoke with the guy who picked us up, he said it happens all the time, particularly to Americans, and it's always the left side, and that's so. Anyway, we wound up, postponing for one more day after we got the car fixed and the tires fixed and went the next day. So it was an adventure just doing that alone. But lifting the stones was really, really awesome. I encourage you to look that up. Again, kind of these ancient lifting stones, and somewhere between 220 up to some of them are over 300 pounds. So we went searching for these things, and I've got some video of them.
We'll have to post it. You have to see him with his kilt.
Yes.
It's so beautiful.
I got a kilt, and the kilt that I chose was a particular color that's the clan gun. So that was the other thing. So we kind of researched some of these things in preparing. And as a Robinson, there really isn't a Clan Robinson, and really Robinson's a very English name. It's not a very Scottish name. Robertson is, but Robinson isn't. So under Clan Gun, there's these different, what they call seps, and Henderson is one. That's a shout out to Julie Henderson. Another one would be Robinson. So I chose those particular colors. And so you had the kilt on and kind of made it as official as I could and just had a lot of fun with it. Yeah.
It was fun. It was beautiful, yeah. All right, let's wrap it up.
Well, I guess why don't we shift now to talking about Farazone.
Yes.
The book is out.
We promised.
Yes.
And here it is. You can actually touch it now.
Yeah, it's a real book now. It's not like a picture like we had a couple of weeks ago. It's a book. It's on Amazon. Check it out.
Just say the Amazon thing because.
Of time. Okay. So it's on Amazon. Check it out.
Yeah.
You can get them at the office as well, but it's all on Amazon. Ebooks, everything, whatever you need. Okay, so let's wrap this up a little bit here. And every week we always do the artisans of sex. So we came up with something kind of special here today. So let's talk about this. Now, there's something called. So we'll start with the science side of it before we get to the art side of it, like we normally do. And so I'll start off with the science. And there's something called microchimerism. Now, this is just a fancy word, just meaning that we can actually transfer cells from one place to another, from one person to another. And particularly in women, there is this concept of microchimerism where there's DNA of the cells and cellular debris and DNA from the fetus that goes into women. We've found it in the brain tissue, we found it in heart tissue and other things. So,
and it's protected. It can be protected.
Very protective, yeah. So it's actually not, the body doesn't see it as a foreign thing. It's a really kind of beautiful thing. And there's a Danish study that actually shows that women who have high amounts of this microchimerism, meaning a lot of DNA perhaps from being pregnant, they have low risk for breast cancer. So there's actually reason for it, and we're finding some reason for it. Another thing, the really elegant study, was a rat study, but what they did with this particular study was rats that were genetically engineered to where they could trace the cells coming from the mother into the fetus.
From the fetus into the mother.
And then they took these little rats and they induced a heart attack in the mother. And so what they were able to do then was watch where those fetal cells went. And they would travel through the body and go up to the heart and literally start repairing the heart to the point where they could restore the heartbeat. So there really is this bond, right? You really like that, huh?
Yeah.
So that's some of the science behind it. Now, I'll say one thing, and one of the reasons probably why I brought this up, because I found another study that came out.
Not as cute.
Yeah, it's not as cute. a little more controversial, but we'll bring it up. It's interesting nonetheless. Yeah, it's provocative nonetheless. So there's another study that came out in 2012. It just kind of got another resurgence here in the past month, and I had come across it. So in 2012 was a PLOS One study where they were looking at autopsies of women, and particularly their brain, and finding DNA, male DNA, in a woman's brain. And they came up with all these ideas of where it was coming from. Of course, the male fetus. It could have been a twin or something, all these different things. But one of the things that they had to conclude, because some of the women, not all of them, but some of the women would have male DNA in their brains, but they never had a male fetus and never were exposed to
Or
it.
were never pregnant.
Or were never even
Or
pregnant.
Nellie Paris,
Yeah.
some of them hadn't even been pregnant.
Correct. Yes. So at that point, how do you explain it? So the only other idea then, and again, this is all conjecture at this point, would be that women are actually receiving DNA through sexual intercourse and semen and sexual intercourse. So that's quite interesting in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
That makes you think, huh?
It definitely makes one think when you're giving that lecture to your daughter about choosing their partners well.
Choose wisely. Right.
Because they do leave an impact.
Well, aside from that, so tell me a little bit about the art of that.
So from the art of it, I think that it is that notion of being impacted by your partners and absorption. The reality is that women are, in general, more selfless and self-giving to the point that they host DNA of their children and of their partners within themselves. And I think it's one of the beautiful notions of the female energy, that she really is so receiving. We've talked about this energy before. We've talked about how that female energy allows us to be more empathic or sympathetic, or why women they tend to make very good listeners, and they're very good at commiserating with their peers instead of problem solving, because we're there to take on. We're there to take on the debris of others, perhaps the DNA debris even. But with that, we're there to take on whatever it is that someone else may need to take off their shoulders so that they can move forward a little bit straighter and a little bit easier, with the knowledge that even if I take it on, even if you take it on, we'll be just fine.
Yeah. Women transform, they transmute that energy. I think that's what's so beautiful. You know, I've seen that saying where you give a woman a house and she'll give you a home. Mm-hmm. There's something transformative about that energy that I think is so beautiful. So, and you certainly do that and provide that for me in more ways than one. And I don't know if I tell you that enough, but it's true. Where are the sex docs? I don't know if you knew that.
Less sex docs, actually.
We got to go to France to really make it stick. So look, here's what we're gonna do. You don't want to read the.
No.
Okay, all right. We don't have we're rambling today.
I think that they're getting bored.
Okay, so next week we're going to read a little bit out of the book, and I think every week that's what we'll attempt to do. Talk a little bit more, little snippets of the book, and maybe answer some questions also about thyroid. And specifically, what we'd like to talk about next week is testosterone replacement therapy in men, and maybe put a little bit of a focus on guys, just in light of this recent trip and presentation. Let's focus a little bit on the men and the women who love them, and we'll talk about that next week. So here's what we definitely know for sure.
Hormones are sexy.
Life is sexy. Testosterone is sexy.
Scotland and England and
Very
Jamie
sexy.
are sexy.
It's the other man in the relationship that I have to deal with. But, some of you know what we're talking about.
Yeah, right. Whatever.
Yes, check out the Highlander. When does it start?
I don't know. Outlander.
Outlander.
I'm not sure.
It's coming.
Or get a man who lifts stones and wears a kilt. I got one.
Yeah, I gotta show the pictures of that. Okay, we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Take care. Have a great week.
Bye.